Almost 5 years ago, in October 24th, 2016, the Ashes of Ariandel DLC was released for Dark Souls 3. With it came new armor, spells, and weapons, being a sizable add-on to the base game. Out of all the new additions, many were interested in the weapons, and myself included. They added a total of 13, each having their own unique attributes and attacks, but one in particular gained arguably the most interest in players, not regarding the Follower's Saber at launch.
What the hell?
And that would be Friede's Great Scythe. Nowadays, if you're an invader or co-opper, I'm sure you've run across it a fair share in the hands of a phantom or opponent. Even more likely, if you fought someone who's using it, they act as if the weapon RR1 is the only attack that the weapon has, and don't get me wrong, that attack is very good, at least on the surface. There's more to the weapon that many neglect, and it's a shame because I'm being serious when I say I think Friede's Scythe is one of the most unique weapons in the game.
Go get 'em. SO2. Yeah. My vision 2020, enough said. I can end you right now, but let me get my head like that. Freaky heads like oh shit, mouth open like wow. Sick stuff pretending like you don't know how. God damn it, which God you we ask, can we all get along? Who we and not say wherever, but who we or how long we gotta be that dumb when they take a candy away while you sucking it up, stuck in the lump. Or mediocre runners, no, not in my camp. Gotta stay league, hustle the champ. Who's getting closer to crunch? Your face is acting reptile. Cold-blooded versus warm-blooded in the reptile. Positions of vision, you wishing you were rather fishing, but they catch you for a hundred kittens, itching for the ditch. Get your paper straight before the last leg taper. Blast off the flag, hold hyper. Let the fog up, see through the walk up. Real hook up, falls flags, pick up, fly punch up. Can't stop us, dirty coppers, spaghetti droppers. Get your coppers, time to step up. Let the fog up, press down, push up. Keep your chin up, put your hands up, out of stick up. Then can't stop us, fat hoppers, and leaf droppers. Get your coppers, who calls step up, step up. Circulating all sitting like a song out broke. Already been through, right the passes paid dues. Collecting notes hand in hand like a tofu. Now I'm speedy gone on ADC. And set straight behind like I feed these kids. It's the saga of a reader by the heathen right. Makes it so I beat the one that beat the clock to the punching. Hit the whole score, the goal and go to luncheon. Sound ascension, it's essential for the soul. I thought you knew I'm playing instrumental. On top of which spill my beans like a lentil. Super fragile, broken hearted, mending with the stencil. Over the crack with the fat cat, what's up? No whistle, danger than a D, you listen. We won't let the flame fit, so let out the lips another mistletoe, bitch, spine so let the fog up, see to the mock up, real hook up, false flags, pick up, fly punch up, can't stop us, dirty coppers, hitting droppers, get your coppers, time to step up, let the fog up, press down, push up, keep your chin up, and put your hands up, out of stick up, then you can't stop us, fat hoppers, and leaf droppers, get your coppers, who gon' step up, step up, step up. So I talk with my flow's awkward, it's awkward. Giving them all chance, these lies, it's addictive. Nice with the hit and been addicted. Attested by the audience, so receptive. Germ killer and deceptive, so effective on the media release. So free media dependency, you'll be able to see. Third eyesight, 6, 7, 8 degree. My vision 20, enough said, I'ma end it right now.
The history of the weapon is actually peculiar in that even though many people who have fought against it consider it obnoxious and the ever so thrown word overpowered, Friede's Scythe was never nerfed, but actually received 3 small buffs. They may not seem too great, but when using it or fighting it, you'll notice these buffs do play a role. Being a boss weapon, you will have to defeat Friede, which can be difficult for novice or low soul level players, But once you defeat her, you can transpose her boss soul at Ludlith at Firelink Shrine and obtain her weapon. To cover some miscellaneous things about the Scythes, against what many people would probably tell you, they aren't bad in this game. Of course, they're not meta Evo tournament weapons, they're just different, and sometimes that can be good in this game. Most people aren't experienced with fighting against Scythes that often, so that's one advantage just by having this weapon in your digital hands. That being said, Scythes can be difficult to get used to. Having an arc to them can make them tricky to land hits in a few situations, and especially on elevation. But that's not an issue that's exclusive to the Scythe class. Another thing to know is that Scythes have a sweet spot mechanic, which means that there's 2 hitboxes on Scythe attacks. What you need to know is that at the end of the Scythe, the blade has a hitbox which deals more overall damage to the target, whereas the shaft or pole of the Scythe has a hitbox that deals reduced damage. Needless to say, you want to outspace your opponent and keep them at a distance so you can hit them with the max amount of damage. More on that later. When you have this weapon, it does demand investment from you in terms of stats to wield, requiring 16 in dexterity, 11 in faith, and 12 in both strength and intelligence. Now keep in mind, this weapon scales the best with dexterity and intelligence, so focus on those if you want to improve the damage on the Scythe, but I'll touch on the intelligence scaling in a moment as it's rather an important point that'll come up in a bit, so just keep that in mind. Once you're able to wield this weapon, what you end up is a Scythe that's the heaviest in its class, at a whopping 13 Miyazakis, has no bleed, and the same range as the Great Scythe and the Pontiff Knight Scythe. What it does have that no other Scythe has is innate frost on all of its attacks, and a unique moveset two-handed, and a unique weapon art. The one-handed moveset is the same as every other Scythe, but two-handed it has a different cycle of light attacks, or R1s, that rotate in a 3-hit sequence. Also, if you hit with the first R1, you can land the second like usual, but if you miss the first R1 and land the second one, you can land the third and final R1 guaranteed, which is similar to other paired weapons, which we need to talk about the bread and butter of the weapon art stance. Once in this state, you can follow up with R1 for a 3-cycle attack, each having 2 hits, one hit with the magic scythe and the other with the main scythe. Keep in mind also that the weapon art R1 of this weapon does not consume focus points, so you can use this as often as you want. If you choose to go for the R2, you'll do an uppercut with the magic scythe with a frost AoE left behind on the ground in front of you that will linger before exploding. Unlike the weapon art R1, this attack does cost 18 focus points in order to use. These weapon art attacks have hyper armor and do a significant amount of frost buildup. 2 weapon art R1s can net you 180 frost buildup, which is almost as much as Vort's Great Hammer's R1-R1 combo. As for the weapon art R2, it seems to deal around their usual 45 frost on this weapon, on the uppercut, with the frost AoE on the ground accumulating frost buildup while they are on it. If the enemy gets hit by the frost AoE explosion, it deals an insane amount of frost buildup which can lead to a proc, dealing a ton of burst damage. Now, remember how I said this weapon has intelligence scaling? Well, it does, but only on the weapon art attacks. See, this weapon deals physical damage on all of its attacks. It's only when the magic scythe, which you can only use on the weapon art, does magic damage, which means that the primary stat you should invest is dexterity, then intelligence, as dexterity will affect all of your attacks. So you want to try out Friede's Scythe, but how exactly do you build for it? Well, because of the spread of stats that the weapon requires, and the stats it scales the best with, being dex and intelligence, unfortunately makes it a weapon you have to build around, which isn't necessarily bad, but your weapon variety does take a hit. Another weapon that comes to mind that has similar investment is the Aquamarine Dagger, which is a beast all on its own, but don't let that dissuade you. If you're going for a different soul level bracket, I'll include my SL56 plus 6, SL81 plus 10, and my SL125 plus 10 in the description to hopefully help you out in deciding how you would like to build around Friede's Scythe. For me, I only reached base requirements for everything besides dexterity unless I had spare levels to invest into intelligence. I would level dexterity to around 30 or 40 depending on the soul level, and dump the rest into vigor and endurance, which Speaking of endurance, I will say you might want to have a decent amount, because while you're not going to be prancing around through the invasion spamming the weapon art, you do want to have enough stamina to keep on the aggression, as the attacks do take a good portion of your stamina. But to remedy this, I would recommend the Chloranthy Ring, particularly the +3 version to recover stamina faster, or Green Blossoms, as they are a good alternative. Before you go out there and give this weapon a whirl, I want to give you some tips that I wish I knew right off the bat, as this weapon took some time to figure out what works and what doesn't. For one, while the two-handed light attacks are unique, they are slower and more telegraphed than the usual two-handed R1s of the other scythes. It seems to have a longer animation by around 5 frames and has a more narrow hitbox, which basically means it's harder to hit people while locked on. The two-handed R1s have really mediocre tracking while locked on, but if you unlock and turn your character, not necessarily the camera, to face your opponent while unlocked, you can surprise them and end up getting that first or second R1. If one of the R1s land, you can relock and get that second R1. It's definitely easier said than done though, and don't feel bad if you can't consistently free aim, as it does take time to master. And heck, even I myself don't have it down like 100%. I'd suggest that if you whiff your first R1 and second R1, not to bother with the third two-handed R1, as it has terrible tracking while locked on, and you will get punished if you're not careful. Back to the sweet spot mechanic, I need to mention that Friede's Scythe is an outlier among the scythes, and that while others have a damage penalty if they don't hit the target with the blade, someone at FromSoft, God bless their heart, made it to where that Friede deals full damage at any range and bonus damage instead if the target gets hit with the sweet spot. It's not much, but we'll take anything we can get on this weapon. As for the weapon art, many of you inexperienced players will gravitate to the weapon art, which I've seen plenty of times, but let me tell you, it's not the end-all be-all. The weapon art does have hyper armor to tank through attacks, but it can still be broken or poised through from a weapon that has perseverance, and the weapon art is parryable on the weapon art R1s. To be more exact, the magic scythe can get parried, but the main scythe can, and when you fight someone who can use their left hand to press parry, you will get parried eventually, and you will eat dirt. Also, the weapon art R1 does have a lot of recovery, which means you'll be vulnerable for a while before you can roll or do any other action after you use it. So I don't want to see y'all spamming it all over Lothric, because Velka may forgive you, but I won't. Now, if you use the weapon art R2, that can be kinda tricky to land the explosion, but just try to use the AoE itself to deter aggression or progression, particularly against multiple enemies. It's better in narrow spaces and can catch someone who's careless. It can give you some breathing room, and just remember that the attack itself is rather slow and is situational at best, but that doesn't make it bad, just difficult to land. It is a nice extra tool that you have while using this weapon. When fighting a more quick opponent, one-handed R1s will be a tad faster, and the running attack one-handed covers a wide area in front of you while being decently quick. If they're too aggressive and you can't keep them off you, I'd suggest using an offhand weapon like a straight sword or hand axe, but after I got used to the scythe some more, I found more success into keeping my offhand empty so I could go into the weapon art to throw off opponents. Now for some notable true combos. All of the two-handed R1s combo into an R2, but unlike the other scythes, if you do an R2 after the first two-handed R1, the R2 will be the horizontal slash versus the rising uppercut, which is good in two ways. One, the horizontal slash covers a broader area in front of you, which can possibly catch any nearby allies of his. And two, weirdly, all other attacks for scythes have the sweet spot mechanic, but it seems that the horizontal slash doesn't, so it deals full damage at any distance, at least from what I could tell. For the one-handed, if you can land an uncharged R2 in the sweet spot distance, it can cause enough stagger to do the first part of the weapon art, which will net you 3 hits total. For some good pseudo combos that work for me, I have 2 in particular that are consistent. One is after landing a two-handed R1-R1 combo, I'd go for 2 weapon art R1s. If you can stagger the opponent on the first weapon art R1, go for the second, as it will true combo. Not only does this deal good damage obviously, but also builds up around 270 frostbite, which most players won't have. If the proc does go off, that just adds to the total amount of damage you'll do, and if there was ever a wombo combo in this game, this is definitely it. The other combo I like doing is the 2 weapon RR1s, but instead of going for the 3rd weapon RR1 like most Friede Scythe users, surprise them with the 2-handed uppercut instead. Most players are going to spam roll out of the initial weapon R combo that they won't be thinking that you're smarter than a crayon eater, so you can land the hit rather easily. Not only do you have more control over the uppercut, but you can also have less recovery time, making it a solid option. Now we've talked about the weapon's moveset and combos, let's talk about the disadvantages that you'll face. Friede Scythe is slightly slower than the other scythes 2-handed and has no bleed, which we've covered before, but it being a scythe also comes with some drawbacks, mainly being the sweet spot mechanic. Most players in invasions are going to either be really passive and hover out of attack range, or they are going to be in your face swinging, which can make it difficult to keep players in that sweet spot range. Tough weapon matchups are going to be weapons with hyper armor like great swords, ultra great weapons, etc, etc. And because some of these weapons have more reach than Friede's and have hyper armor on majority or all of their attacks, it can be difficult to fight even if you use the Friede's weapon art. There's only so much you can poise through before you inevitably get staggered, so keep that in mind. For some of the advantages that the Friede Scythe has, it does deal good stamina damage against shields, and deals chip damage against them even when they're blocking, which means you can somewhat deal with turtles. It also, being a scythe, means you have more range than what others are expecting, and since scythes are a rare weapon to come across in general, they may not know how to space it. Frostbite being innate on all of the attacks is also beneficial since it can deal burst damage similar to bleed, and causes an absorption and stamina debuff. The weapon art being unique and very useful compared to the other scythes is also welcome since it has damage, hyper armor, range, and high frostbite build-up potential that can deter people from getting too comfortable against you. It also granting bonus damage on the sweet spot versus having a penalty if you miss makes it a lot more rewarding to land hits. So now you know everything that I know and everything that I wanted to give to you, the viewer, to hopefully help you if and when you try this weapon out, which I hope you do at least once, and if you've tried it before but didn't like it, give it another spin. You may enjoy it more than when you last left it. Using this weapon was a lot of fun, and I know many invaders in particular who hate this weapon, which I was one of those people before I tried it out, and because I did use it, I not only found a personal favorite weapon, but also got new insight on how to fight it if I come across it, so I'd encourage you to give it a try, and get out of that mindset of it being a ganker weapon. Because while it's used by a lot of inexperienced and ganker players, that shouldn't stop you from having fun with the weapon in the game. I wanted to let this video be the 500 sub special to show gratitude to the small little group that watches these. I know I don't upload every day or anything like that, but I do genuinely appreciate you, the viewer, because I know how it's like to be a viewer, so thank you. I may not personally know you, and we may just know each other from our online personas, but I like to think that even though we don't interact every day or in real life, we can still be friends, and I hope you stick around. No matter what happens with this channel in the future, I'll always be glad I got to interact with y'all. Stay healthy, safe, and don't go hollow, fellas. For every day that we live, we get closer to Elden Ring. But in all seriousness, have a great day. Keep that head up, and take care. This has been Derpy. I'll see you guys later.
Moonlit cafe, jazz in the background. Clock strikes 12 as my partner gets sat down. Mad town, ain't it? Heard him say between the sirens, but we both knew the answer, so there's no point in replying now. Someone made a call about an hour ago about a body found left out on Countington Road. No signs of struggle, no trauma sticking out or exposed. Just a heart-shaped locket with 2 flowers enclosed. A single rose in a gold-tinted tunic with an old scented tulip wrapped around its fragile stem. And behind the floor, Azora was engraved about